Hello, and welcome to MTG Another Look. These are cards that you should take another look at. Don't forget to like and subscribe to help the channel. Thank you. First, let's take a look at Headliner Scarlett from the Ravnica Clue Edition. It's 3 and a red for a legendary human warlock. She's a 3/3 with haste, and when Headliner Scarlett enters the battlefield, creatures target player controls can't block this turn. At the beginning of your upkeep, exile the top card of your library face down. You may look at and play that card this turn. So the more I look at this card, the more I like it. First of all, it's on rate for the once per turn impulse draw in red. The other permanents that have this effect usually cost 4 or 5 mana and are all pretty playable. In Commander, card advantage is king, and these permanents are red's bread and butter when it comes to trying to keep up with the rest of the table. Red is, I think, the color with the worst card advantage at this point in time. But if you're playing a red deck without other colors that can draw cards better, then it's important to play cards like this. Not only that, but Headliner Scarlett is a creature, which comes with upsides and downsides, but I'd argue it provides more upside in this case. Comparing it to other creatures with the ability, a lot of them have to attack to get the impulse draw, like with Lelia the Blade Reforged or Breach's Eager Pilferer. That works well enough, and those cards are very strong, but sometimes you end up in a situation where every opponent has blockers and you don't have any good attacks. In those scenarios, the impulse draw is shut off. That's not ideal. You won't have that problem with Headliner Scarlett. Every turn it's on the board is a turn you get access to an extra card to play. With that basic impulse draw effect, Headliner Scarlett will synergize with the typical play from exile strategies. It'll deal damage with Passionate Archaeologist and copy spells with Nalfeshni. Pretty standard stuff, but with the critical mass of cards that synergize with the strategy, anything that sets these triggers off will be easy includes in deck building. But what makes Headliner Scarlett so interesting is the ETB effect. When she enters, you get to choose an opponent to be unable to block for the turn. That will leave your target open to an alpha strike. Headliner Scarlett can act as player removal and eliminate your biggest problem at the table no matter how many blockers they have. It can turn a situation where an opponent thinks they're safe and taps out to play something irrelevant into a turn where they wish they held up removal. An extra little cherry on top is the haste tacked on, so no matter what, you'll be hitting for an extra 3 damage on your alpha strike turn. Headliner Scarlett is a nice include in a deck just for the card advantage, but with the extra utility of being able to be a finisher in the right situations. It's great for aggressive decks, and it also provides a little bit of longevity to those strategies that aggro tends to lack. And since the one-sided chaos effect is on an ETB ability, that means Scarlett synergizes with blink effects and reanimation. I have a Boros blink deck that this would go great in. With the ability to blink Scarlett, you can make multiple opponents unable to block on multiple turns, and it won't have to take the turn off from attacking since it has haste. As of the time of writing this, Headliner Scarlett is only in 400 decks and costs about $1. I think this card is being woefully underutilized. It's a scrappy little card that can help you bust through board stalls for the win, and I think it deserves a lot more attention. Headliner Scarlett fits well in the typical Prosper Tombbound decks, or in Pia Nalar Console of Revival, and decks that care about ETB effects like Kadric Soulkindler. Next up is Kopec Wraith. It's a card from the Warhammer Commander decks. It's 3 mana for an artifact creature, Wraith. It's a 2/1 that's unblockable. When Kopec Wraith deals combat damage to a player, you may pay 3 and sacrifice it. If you do, choose a land you control. Then search your library for up to 2 basic land cards which have the same name as the chosen land, put them onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle. Kopec Wraith is a card I think of in the same way as Burnished Heart. It costs 6 mana and can ramp you 2 basic lands. Unfortunately, there are some differences that make Kopec Wraith a bit more unreliable if your sole intention is using it as ramp. You do have to deal combat damage to a player to be able to sacrifice it for the ramp effect. Granted, it is unblockable, so it shouldn't be too hard for that to happen. But, barring haste enablers, the Wraith is going to take 2 whole turns before you have access to the mana from the lands you searched for. In that case, it is a downside compared to Burnished Heart, because Burnished Heart can be sacrificed the turn you play it, making it only a 1-turn wait to access the mana. And it can be sacrificed in response to some effect that will kill it. It can be used as a blocker and then sacked, or dodge a wrath. The Wraith can unfortunately do none of those things. However, the Wraith creature type is relevant post Lord of the Rings. It synergizes with the Nazgul and can be an unblockable attacker in those decks. The Wraith creature type doesn't exactly have a deep bench of playable cards, and Kopec Wraith is one of maybe 2 non-Lord of the Rings cards that fit the bill. The Wraith typal decks are a bit niche, and while good there, I think Kopec Wraith fits well as a second burnish art in decks that are hard up for ramp. If you're an Rakdos deck that requires big mana, getting 2 more lands can be vital, and there are just not a lot of good cards that can search out extra lands, especially if the deck is focused on creature synergies that cards like Wayfarer's Bauble don't interact with. One important thing to note, however, is that the Wraith can only search for lands with the same name as one you already control. That means you're going to have to play a decent number of basics, something I believe decks should already be doing. So if you do put it in a deck, make sure your mana base is suited for it. Kopec Wraith fits well in Witch King, Sky Scourge, Osgir the Reconstructor, and Mishra, Eminent One. Next, let's talk about Winds of Abandon. For 1 and a white, it's a sorcery that says, exile target creature you don't control. For each creature exiled this way, its controller searches their library for a basic land card. Those players put those cards onto the battlefield tapped, then shuffle, and it has Overload for 4 and 2 white. Winds of Abandon is a very powerful card that I like to play in a whole lot of my white decks. For 2 mana, it's a slow path to exile, costing an extra mana and being sorcery speed. In a pinch, that's a very relevant mode to play the spell with. There are plenty of times when a player presents a threat that will make you lose the game if you don't deal with it that turn. There are plenty of commanders that need to be killed on sight or they will take over the game completely. If you see a Kali of the Vast or a Nekusar the Mindraiser, you need to remove that threat immediately, because if you allow them to untap, they're going to do unholy things to you. And when you need it, a sorcery speed path is serviceable. But what makes Winds of Abandon so special is the Overload effect. Winds, like the other playable cards with Overload, like Cyclonic Rift and Delayed Blast Fireball, has the ability to be a blowout that opens players up to alpha strikes. The wording on Overload cards often specifies that the target be permanents that you don't control. Your board of creatures is never going to be wiped out with these 3 cards. Each will be a one-sided board wipe, and that's extremely powerful. Cards with the flexibility to be played as a cheap early removal spell or as a one-sided board wipe are amazing in Commander. In a singleton format with lots of variants, cards that can perform dual roles are more vital than just big haymakers that you sometimes won't be able to cast. I think a lot of people may see the downside of Winds of Abandon and be turned off to the idea of playing it at all. The idea of giving your opponents lands, admittedly, can sometimes be risky or backfire. It's possible to ramp an opponent into a game-winning Torment of Hailfire, and you definitely need to be wary of that and not play it when you're susceptible to being blown out. But, on the other hand, a large percentage of the player base has a bad habit of playing too few basic lands. And Winds of Abandon only searches for basic lands. Against 4 or 5 color decks, or players who stuff their decks with as many utility lands as they can, your opponents may only be able to put 1 to 3 basic lands into play, even if you exile the board of a dozen creatures each. Winds of Abandon is a great way to punish greedy mana bases. And Winds of Abandon goes great with a couple light stacks pieces. If you have an Aven Mind Sensor or an opposition agent, you can blast opposing creatures without even the decency of giving them their basics in return. These highly playable cards synergize with Winds of Abandon in a devastating way. The fact that Winds of Abandon exiles is important. There are maybe 3 or 4 good exile wraths in white, and none of them are guaranteed to be one-sided. In control decks that won't care if they exile their own permanents, the symmetrical exile wraths are far more effective. Play Farewell and Sunfall in those decks instead. But if you're in a deck that wants to be aggressive, Winds of Abandon is a must include. If you have a board of creatures that you don't want to lose, but your opponents have managed to gum up the battlefield with blockers, drawing a Farewell or Sunfall is going to set you back as much, if not more than your opponents. But Winds of Abandon is going to be the perfect card in that situation. It'll exile every creature in your way and allow you to keep attacking without putting a hitch in your step. Winds of Abandon has the ability to win you the game immediately in a way that more favored but symmetrical removal never can. Winds of Abandon is a vital include in aggressive decks like Adeline, Resplendent Cathar, Jetmir, Nexus of Revels, and Caesar, Legion's Emperor. Let's talk about Hulking Raptor. This is a 5/3 dinosaur for 2 and 2 green. It has Ward 2 and reads, at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, add 2 green mana. This is a pretty simple card, but pretty powerful as well. The 5 power for 4 mana is pretty serviceable. It's on rate or above rate as far as mana cost. That means it goes well in aggressive strategies also. In fact, that's where it shines the most. The reason to play this card is the 2 extra mana it adds on each of your turns. Going from 4 mana on turn 3 or 4, playing Hulking Raptor and then untapping with access to 7 mana is a massive jump in mana production. With any kind of ramp in the first 2 turns, this allows a turn 4 Etali Primal Conqueror. Having a simple turn 2 Rampant Growth in your Hulking Raptor can produce massive 7 mana Haymakers. Usually, you'd need multiple more ramp spells or $100 mana rocks to produce mana that quickly, and at time of writing, this card is less than $1. Usually, a card that can give such a large tempo boost would be a removal target, and having that Ward 2 ability can really put a kink in players' attempts to interrupt your speedy ramping. That little something extra really helps protect your strategy on early turns. A dilemma that aggressive decks face is sometimes facing the choice of putting out dangerous creatures early in the game and not having access to as much mana as other players, or ramping but not putting enough early pressure on opponents. An aggressive deck that takes turns 2 and 3 off to ramp can really take the edge off of opponents and give them the breathing room they need to consolidate their resources and stabilize against your threats. What's so great about Hulking Raptor is that it does both. It helps you ramp into bigger and more dangerous threats in the early game, while posing a beefy threat that your opponents need to answer or find blockers for. Landing a quick Hulking Raptor can help you punish a player with a slow start. Taking 5 life out of an opponent that couldn't mount a board presence in the early turns can be very punishing. For aggro decks, Hulking Raptor gives you the best of both worlds. I see a lot of players playing Hulking Raptor just in their dinosaur decks, like Pantlaza, Sun Favored, but I think it's a great addition to most stompy decks like Xenagos, God of Revels, and Goreclaw, Terror of Calcisma. Lastly, let's talk about Kitesail Larcenist. Kitesail Larcenist is a 2/3 human pirate for 2 and a blue. It has flying in Ward 1 and reads, when Kitesail Larcenist enters the battlefield, for each player, choose up to 1 other target artifact or creature that player controls. For as long as Kitesail Larcenist remains on the battlefield, the chosen permanents become treasure artifacts with tap, sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color, and lose all other abilities. So, Kitesail Larcenist is creature or artifact removal in blue, a color that almost never gets it. There are more creature removal spells in blue than artifact removal, and Kitesail Larcenist having the option to remove both is pretty great. There aren't too many I can think of that can deal with both, besides getting creative and bouncing or confiscating them. The 2 that I could think of are Resculpt and Ravenform. Resculpt is very playable, but Ravenform is a little fringe in my opinion. I think it has its place in some decks, but the sorcery speed makes it a lot worse. Kitesail Larcenist is sorcery speed as well, however it does remove 1 permanent belonging to each opponent. A 3-for-1 is much more impactful than a 1-for-1 in Commander, even if the Larcenist ability is reversible. And because the ability that turns each permanent into a treasure is all attached to the same creature, it ties the fate of all the removed permanents together. Let me explain. If one player has a threat that you want off the table, but your opponents are also desperate to have it off the table, it may be in their best interest to keep the Kitesail Larcenist around. Sure, it may hurt to have a permanent treasure fied, but it may hurt a lot less if the other treasures used to be Bolas' Citadel, or another player's devastating commander. It may be better to have your shared opponent's game-winning artifact turned off than to get your not-so-great creature back. Or it may just turn all your opponents against you because they all have a shared interest in their permanents returning to normal. But that's the risk you take when playing something like a Grasp of Fate. If you're expecting a Wrath to go off, you can also hide a key permanent under the Kitesail Larcenist, so that when all creatures die, your creature will return back to normal once the Larcenist leaves play. That's a benefit of it being a creature, and another is the ability to reanimate it easier for multiple uses. Kitesail Larcenist has a rare ability in blue, and is a versatile card that can open up interesting political scenarios. It sees play in a lot of pirate builds because of its creature type, like in Admiral Brass and Sinkable, but I think it has a lot of utility beyond that. It goes great in something like Azuri Claw of Progress with the very limited removal options in Simic, or in Kellen Inquisitive Prodigy. I want to say thank you to everyone that joined me today to discuss some cool commander deck options. What do you think of these cards? Are they worth a shot in one of your decks? Let me know in the comments and join me next time to take another look. Have a great day.